So good morning, everybody. I hope you had a pleasant evening in Brussels after yesterday's very encouraging starting of this important conference. My name is Helmut Scholz. I'm a member of the conference group of the United European Left, Nordic Green Left group here in the European Parliament, the coordinator for our group in the International Trade Committee. So that is my approach to the theme we are discussing over the 2 days here. I'm really happy about the opportunity to moderate such a challenging panel this morning here in the European Parliament, changing our destination from GDP growth to progress within planetary limits. And I can welcome here Mrs. Achtsióglou. She is a Greek Minister of Labour in Athens. Welcome here in Brussels. I want to welcome Mrs. Leida Rijnhout, who is the co-founder of the SDG Watch, which is just on the top of the awareness of including people and citizens to think about the theme in a much broader understanding as maybe some specialists are doing. I'm very happy to welcome Mr. Christian Felber. He is author of the Economy for the Common Goods from Austria. Mr. Patrick ten Brink, he is the EU Policy Director in the EIB. And last but not least, Joost Koorte, he is the Director General in the DG Employment of the European Commission. So just introduce this panel to all of you. Let me speak 2 minutes on following question. Since 1980, the human population has increased threefold, and the need of fossil fuels increases 16 times higher than the increase of population, the use of water 9 times. At the same time, the economic performance grew up to 40 times in comparison with 1918. And these kind of development lead us to many urgent problems. And we are all dealing with climate change, with the question of consumption, of the production criteria, etc. And 3 examples. Every year, all deserts in the world are growing in the size of Ireland because of deforestation, the growing agriculture, and some other reasons. 3/4 of all fish stocks are overfished already today. Because of climate change, the ice of the Arctic is 4% thinner than 40 years ago. These are alarming signals we all know about. But we are all knowing as well that the growth of GDP will not solve and solute our problems. It is only part of the problem expressing the understanding of growth, as it was yesterday also stressed in the opening panel. So probably we agree altogether that we need another economic model, and which is much more sustainable. But what does that mean? And is a GDP as a measurement for growth in the past still an indicator useful, or is it a useless indicator to measure sustainable development? The GDP tells us about the productivity, but nothing about the degree of inequality, resource exhaustion, specific extinctions, debt or death from air pollution, and a lot of other important facts. In the past years, alternative indicators have been proposed, like the Genuine Progress Indicator or the Human Development Index. And also the European Commission, and probably we are dealing in this panel with this issue, has developed new approaches to that, together with the Club of Rome, the OECD, the World Wide Fund, etc. And the European Parliament, not at least, has evolved a Beyond GDP roadmap in 2009. The first update came 2013, and I think we are on the eve of going even further into that direction, trying to refer to the 20 indicators at the side of the GDP we are already now practicing. And part of this are also social indicators: life expectancy, poverty rates, unemployment, and environmental indicators: water pollution, caused waste, in short, all the ecological footprints. And being a member of the European Parliament, I know what I'm speaking about, because normally we are coming here by plane to Brussels from the different angles, from the European Union member states, from regions there, coming by car or by train to the capitals, flying here, etc. So I know what it means to have a democratically sustained parliamentary assembly, which is in a certain way not really ecological, transporting ourselves into the European capital, Brussels, or to Strasbourg. So that's why it is of great importance to talk about what's next. Is this, beyond the GDP initiative, the end of our possibilities? What are the economists contributing to this discussion? Are we satisfied with the current situation of post-growth? If not, and I'm not, we should talk about how could we set other benchmarks for progress to the top of the political agenda, and especially for the European Commission. So let's look into this panel, and I would hand over immediately to Mr. Patrick ten Brink, but we have introduced in this workshop a Slido questioning. We propose to use certain questions, and I would ask you to take actively part in our discussions, so that after, on the hashtag 9276, you can raise your how to say it, competition of questions and your preference, what you would ask to ourselves in this panel, so that we are producing a very active and interactive debate this morning. Yes, please.
We are struggling with the password. Maybe that can be shown on the screen. So that we need that first before.
The password.
For the guests.
Nick, can you help once more? It should be on. I can't see it. My eyes are not. Not
you can see it, but you can't read it.
Yeah. So.
(9276).
But it's also the Wi-Fi code, probably.
Yeah. So, Patrick, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I'm Patrick ten Brink of the European Environmental Bureau. We're co-organizers together here for this. And I'd just like to say thanks to Nick on our side, Nick Menon, who's actually been the main brain on our side. I've been asked to do two things. One is to very quickly put a bit of context, and then after the four speakers to try to do a little bit of a wrap-up, because you've got four pieces of jigsaw to pull together. So on the background, very quickly, as already introduced, we had a Beyond GDP discussion has been focused historically on issues of measurement. We had the 2007 Beyond GDP conference, which actually wasn't the first one. You actually had one 20 years before. And then you had a series of other events. And since then, you've had commitments to interesting indicators, to accounts, to various practice. Now, measurement is really, really important. However, it's only parts of the picture. We need to also look at basically the practice and the tools, and that's a big focus of today. But as a wider bit of context, we also want to go back to the Club of Rome and their calls for resource efficiency problems and problems for humanity. As Professor Tim Jackson said yesterday, a lot of people have been saying the Club of Rome was wrong, but in fact he underlined that the facts actually say the Club of Rome was right. But actually there's an additional element which is really important, and that is the issue of climate change and also our ecosystem tipping points, such that it's not just resource efficiency which is driving a debate towards beyond GDP, but it's also a range of other concerns. So we're worried about running out of resources, but in fact it's more of an issue of not using all the resources we have when it comes to, say, coal and oil. So the question of divestment and also the issue of stranded assets becomes an important part of degrowth. Another part of the practice and the reality that we've seen in the last decade is the issue of equity and inequality. This is about a range of different issues, whether it's health, whether it's income, and so on and so forth, whether it's jobs. And so on that area, we also need to think about having a wider post-growth, which actually takes into account the social dimension, and several of our speakers will talk about jobs and equity issues. And here the evidence also, in this wider context, has shown that you can have much higher jobs with certain types of activity, for example, renewables rather than fossil, for agroecological practices rather than intensive agriculture. So part of the beyond GDP post-growth debate is also where we wish to grow and where we wish to degrow. And I think that's a core practical part of it. In addition, there's been progress as well with commitments, and the SDGs has been a massive international commitment. It is both a set of indicators and a set of political actions and commitments, and I think we'll hear some interesting thoughts on that. So then, overarchingly, where the wider context is, we've talked a lot about the need, the physical need, the physics behind the need for post-growth, the social aspects and the measurement aspects. But where we need to go now with the discussion is really about what are the levers each of us can do, not just the vision, but what are the actions. So how can we move towards this transition and get the economic transition happening? So I'll leave that because we'll get back to that aspect. And now we'll have the insights to the four deep practical experiences from different perspectives. So thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I would give the floor to Mrs. Effie Achtsióglou. She is the Minister of Labour, and maybe you can describe how we are coming to this theme from your practical experience in today's situation in Greece.
Thank you very much. Dear members of the European Parliament, dear friends, dear Helmut, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me this opportunity to address the European Parliament and to talk about my country's path to growth over the last years and the years to come, and how this is, in my view, interlinked with the future of Europe. The last time I had the chance to address the European Parliament was 2 years ago, and a couple of weeks before I took over the duties as a Minister of Labour in Greece. Back then, my country and the Greek government were standing at a very critical stage. The second review of the last economic adjustment programme was about to start, in which the thorniest issue was the issue of labour market reforms. I was then called to present to some of the members of the European Parliament the position of the Greek government regarding major labour market issues, positions which I had then to defend for months and months to come during exhausting negotiations with the Troika of the European Commission, the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Today, Greece stands at a totally different place. After the 21st of August, Greece stands again on its own feet. The Greek economy has not only been stabilized, but it recovers dynamically. The 21st of August is the day that we had the clean exit from the programs of economic adjustment that were implemented in the country for the past 8 years. The Greek government can again set and implement its policies freely in deliberation with the society and not in negotiation with technocrats that most of the time did not have the democratic legitimization. And this result was not given. 8 years ago, the policies of deficits, of spreading public money, the deep corruption of previous governments have led the country to the limits of bankruptcy. In the years to come, during the first 2 programs of economic adjustments, the inability of institutions to prioritize the necessary structural reforms, along with the persistence of some of them, to recipes of extreme fiscal constraints, have led the country to suffocate economically and the Greek people to their limits. From 2010 to 2014, Greece lost 1/4 of its GDP, 25% of its GDP. Unemployment skyrocketed to 27.9%, and unemployment for the youth came around 60%. Inequalities exploded. The poorest quarter of the population lost almost 40% of their income, while the richest quarter of the population increased their participation by 10%. The population in danger of poverty and social exclusion climbed to 36%. The material deprivation for children climbed to 27%. There were drastic pay cuts for all public servants and pensioners, mass layoffs in both the public and the private sector. the minimum wages were reduced within one night by 22%, and for young workers, the wages were reduced by 32%. The public debt exploded as well, the foreign investments were vanished, and thousands of young scientists left the country. The Greek economic crisis and the failure to deal with it was turned also into a European political crisis. 3 years after, Greece has become quite a different country. Instead, being part of the problem, I think that we have now become part of the solution for Europe. The clean exit from the programs of economic adjustment last August has been earned by the Greek people. We managed to restore public finances. We undertook structural reforms that should have taken place a long time ago. We left recession behind and led the economy to growth again. We limited tax evasion and set an end to wasting public money through various channels of corruption. What is more important, in my view, is that we have proven that there is a way to exit crisis without dismantling society and suppress the working population. From the first day we took office, in January 2015, we took drastic measures to address the humanitarian crisis that hit the society the previous years. These measures were not temporary, but in 2017 they were transformed into a structural reform, the social solidarity income. It's the Greek version of the minimum guaranteed income, which is now granted to more than 600,000 people. Under extraordinary fiscal conditions, we designed and implemented a program of major social relief for those most in need. At the same time, and while under extremely tight fiscal conditions, we provided universal access of the uninsured to the national health system in February 2016, covering a significant number of people in need. Thus, we managed to decrease the rates of poverty and social exclusion by creating a nest of social policies for the most vulnerable, a nest that was never there in the country before. We also undertook structural reforms, such as the reform of the pension system and of the social insurance system, where we unified all social insurance schemes into one, and we rationalized the social insurance system. Thus, we had passed now to a system that is strong, a public social insurance scheme that is strong, that is no longer in deficits, that can guarantee the benefits and pensions to people. Today, not only have we exited the economic adjustment program, but also by achieving a sustainable solution to the public debt issue, the economic sovereignty of the country has been regained and the country has taken again the place it deserves within the European Union. In 2017, Greece returned to growth, to positive rates of growth. For this year, it is estimated that the economy will show a growth rate of approximately 2.5%, while in 2017, foreign investments marked record high of the last decade. During the past 3 years, Greece has been one of the few countries that has expanded the protection of civil rights and freedoms through a series of legislative acts that enhanced those who were socially excluded. But what is most important is that we set the labour and its protection at the epicenter of our strategy for the economy's recovery. Against the model of internal devaluation which was applied during the first 2 programmes of economic adjustment, providing for a reduction in wages, in labour costs, through direct wage cuts and general restrictions on labour rights, we opposed a different model, the model of socially fair and sustainable growth, in which wage growth and labour rights are prerequisites of economic growth. In particular, we have restored collective bargaining in the country by setting back in force its 2 cornerstones, the extension principle and the favourability principle, which were indefinitely suspended in 2011. And thanks to this restoration, already a number of collective agreements, of sectoral collective agreements, have become obligatory, which means that that there is an important number of employees, now approximately 200,000 employees, that are seeing important wage increases. The past 3 years we set in force a new legislative framework which shields core labour rights regarding working time and payment, and introduced a series of measures which tackle undeclared and underdeclared work. This transition from a deregulated labour market to a new one, I cannot say yet a regulated or a normal, but we are in a transition from a deregulated labour market to a new one with respect to workers' rights highlights our own growth strategy, that there can be no inclusive and sustainable growth based on labour and social fragmentation. Within 3 years, unemployment has dropped by more than 7%. More than 300,000 jobs have been created in the country. And after exiting the MOUs last August, the dawn of the new era for Greece finds all workers to be supported by a radically different framework, the main pillars of which are collective bargaining, the effort to tackle unemployment, the strengthening of labour inspectorate body, so to guarantee that what is written in the legislation is actually applied in the places of work, as well as a series of legislative provisions for the protection of workers. And we are now kicking off the process for the steady increase of the minimum wage threshold to be achieved in January 2019. While in a large part of Europe the attack against the world of work continues, we are committed to reinforce the workers, their negotiating power and their income, and to set their protection at the epicentre of our efforts, at the core of our growth strategy, at the centre of our future. We still have a lot of work to do before we can look the Greek citizens in the eyes and be proud of what we have achieved, but I think that we've taken some important steps that allow us to be optimistic again. And these successful steps that Greece has taken are also steps of success for Europe as a whole, because they prove that within a spirit of solidarity and cooperation, Europe can overcome the crisis. What is at stake nowadays in Europe is of existential nature. The way Europe dealt with the economic and refugee crisis has brought to the fore some major contradictions and deficiencies that we have to look straight and clearly and deal with them. We have to face this reality. It was the failure of the neoliberal management of crisis that fed public discontent and right-wing populism. It was this failure that brought to the fore far-right forces. They brought them back to the political front. And today we are not only facing the electoral rise of some extreme forces of nationalist and populist far-right parties, we are facing the penetration of xenophobic agenda in the democratic spectrum. And we bear a great
model. And this is a very representative survey. It's not from the SDG platform. It's from a government-closed think tank. And it's very surprising. So something is deeply going wrong with the current mainstream model. And my analysis is that we are mixing up goals and means. And GDP growth is just the means at best, but it's not the goal, never the goal. And if you remember what already Aristotle distinguished, he distinguished two not only different types of how to understand and to practice the economy, but two opposite versions of how to understand the true economy. It's already said in the word oikonomia, and its opposite. Oikonomia, from ancient Greek, I hope you correct me if I'm doing wrong now. But oikos, the house, nomos, already quite curious enough. It's the moral rules thanks to which we manage the house. So if economics considers itself a value-free science, it doesn't even remember what the original meaning of the word economy is. It's the moral rules, because we want to achieve a normative goal. Oikos, the house, nomos, already quite curious enough. It's the moral rules thanks to which we manage the house. So if economics considers itself a value-free science, it doesn't even remember what the original meaning of the word economy is. It's the moral rules, because we want to achieve a normative goal, a telos, which is the well-being of all household members. That's the original meaning. I'm a linguist, at least, although not Greek, meaning of the word economy. And what he stressed various times, money or capital are just means to achieve the goal. And if the means turned into the goal, this would by definition not be an economy anymore, but it would be its opposite. In ancient Greek, krematistike, the art of making money and to get rich. And today we just call it capitalism. If there is no legal definition of capitalism, because it's just a political term, as a linguist, I may offer you help. Be aware of any ism, because what is in front of the ism is exaggerated usually, and at least it's the highest value in this order. In capitalism, capital is the highest value, and this does not mean that human dignity or social cohesion or climate protection is not a goal or a value, but there are lower goals. And in the conflict of goals, capital is the higher goal. That's why the increase of capital is the highest goal. And this is what we measure. And one more, please. And this is what we measure in the current economy. If you look at the way how we used to measure success in the economy, given that success is usually measured according to the achievement of the goal, you see that that on all levels of the economy, GDP, financial profit of a company, and financial return on investment of a single investment, they all are financial or monetary metrics. Although anywhere in the world where you learn project management, you learn that the success of your project, whatever it is, no matter if it's a cultural project, a project of personal development, a political party, or the national economy, success is always measured first and foremost according to the achievement of the goal. But if the goal of a true economy is the common good, then this is a failure of method on all levels and not only on the national economy's level. And a correct way to measure success would be metrics according to the common good or the well-being on all levels. And that's the core of our proposals. And if you think this is just a reminiscence of Aristotle, can you go 2 slides back, please? Yes, thanks. Then we find in all constitutions of democratic countries, they repeat and confirm what Aristotle said. They say that the overarching goal of economic activities is the common good, and you won't find a single constitution of a democratic country that says that the accumulation of capital or the increase of money shall be the overarching goal of economic activities. That would be a capitalistic economic order, and it's not supported by any democratic constitution, whereas all democratic constitutions support a true economic order, which by definition is an economy for the common good. Actually, an economy for the common good is a tautology, is a pleonasm. But we have to call it an economy for the common good because grammatists have occupied the term of economy, kicked out its original meaning, and filled it up with the opposite significance. That's what has happened, and so I'm making a plea for remembering the original meaning of economy. Yeah. Distinguish two not only different types of how to understand and to practice the economy, but two opposite versions of how to understand the true economy. It's already said in the word oikonomia, and its opposite. Oikonomia, from ancient Greek, I hope you correct me if I'm doing wrong now. But oikos, the house. Nomos, already quite curious enough. It's the moral rules thanks to which we manage the house. So if economics considers itself a value-free science, it doesn't even remember what the original meaning of the word economy is. It's the moral rules because we want to achieve a normative goal at telos, which is the well-being of all household members. That's the original meaning. I'm a linguist, at least, although not Greek. Meaning of the word economy. And what he stressed various times, money or capital are just means to achieve the goal. And if the means turned into the goal, this would by definition not be an economy anymore, but it would be its opposite. In ancient Greek, krematistike, the art of making money and to get rich. And today we just call it capitalism. If there is no legal definition of capitalism, because it's just a political term, as a linguist, I may offer you help. Be aware of any ism, because what is in front of the ism is exaggerated usually, and at least it's the highest value in this order. In capitalism, capital is the highest value, and this does not mean that human dignity or social cohesion or climate protection is not a goal or a value, but there are lower goals. And in the conflict of goals, capital is the higher goal. That's why the increase of capital is the highest goal. And this is what we measure. And one more, please. And this is what we measure in the current economy. If you look at the way how we used to measure success in the economy, given that success is usually measured according to the achievement of the goal, you see that that on all levels of the economy, GDP, financial profit of a company, and financial return on investment of a single investment, they all are financial or monetary metrics. Although anywhere in the world where you learn project management, you learn that the success of your project, whatever it is, no matter if it's a cultural project, a project of personal development, a political party, or the national economy, success is always measured first and foremost according to the achievement of the goal. But if the goal of a true economy is the common good, then this is a failure of method on all levels and not only on the national economy's level. And a correct way to measure success would be metrics according to the common good or the well-being on all levels. And that's the core of our proposals. And if you think this is just a reminiscence of Aristotle, can you go 2 slides back, please? Yes, thanks. Then we find in all constitutions of democratic countries, they repeat and confirm what Aristotle said. They say that the overarching goal of economic activities is the common good, and you won't find a single constitution of a democratic country that says that the accumulation of capital or the increase of money shall be the overarching goal of economic activities. That would be a capitalistic economic order, and it's not supported by any democratic constitution, whereas all democratic constitutions support a true economic order, which by definition is an economy for the common good. Actually, an economy for the common good is a tautology, is a pleonasm. But we have to call it an economy for the common good because grammatists have occupied the term of economy, kicked out its original meaning, and filled it up with the opposite significance. That's what has happened, and so I'm making a plea for remembering the original meaning of economy. Yeah. Alternatives to GDP are on the way. We are talking about Better Life Index. We're talking about SDG. The most charming, to my understanding, is the Gross National Happiness from Bhutan. Not only because it looks at all conditions of life quality, but also because the oikoi, the households, are asked. So it's not the experts who judge how good we are. It's the people who are asked how good they are. And our proposal is that the experts make the preparations. They have done the preparations with these indicators that already exist. But the real work could be done by the citizens, meaning that the citizens of the European Union define the 20 most relevant ingredients of life quality. And this will be the democratically composed common good product. The European Commission, maybe that's one question to my panel partner, published a Plan D in 2004 after the disaster of the referenda on the European Constitution, which failed in France and in the Netherlands. As a lesson out of that, the Lisbon Treaty was made out of it, and as a lesson of the failure of the referendum, the Plan D was made by the European Commission, which was called Democracy, Dialogue and Discussion. And it was said that the European Union wants to listen more seriously to their citizens. If this is a true attitude, then the European Union could involve its citizens in the most important political exercise, which is the definition of the 20 most relevant ingredients of life quality or elements of common good, which for sure includes a healthy and sound environment, a stable climate, and conservation of biodiversity, meaning all main factors of an ecologically sustainable economy and civilization. And if all policymakers would have to assess their policy proposals according to the policy measures' impact on the common good product, then we will not assess, for example, CETA, the trade agreement with Canada, if it contributes to GDP growth, first and foremost, but they would have to assess CETA if it contributes to further social cohesion, to a more just distribution, to a lower ecological footprint, to an increase in biodiversity, to higher minimum wages, to more workers' rights and all that. That would be the logical, legally binding assessment of any policy measure. And this is not a dream. This is already done in Bhutan, although Bhutan is not a role model for everything. But just for this exercise, I think it's a best practice. And the same with the other two levels. We have already developed the common good balance sheet for companies. And if you go two further and one more, yes. It's a scorecard between fundamental values because constitutional values are the highest goods in a democratic society. That's on the green line. We are matching fundamental values from human dignity to democracy with all stakeholders of a company. And behind there are 100 pages which have been implemented by more than 500 companies, organizations, municipalities and universities. But 11 years student from Barcelona has summarized it in a perfect way. She said, I understand the common good balance sheet that a company or any organization is measured if the product it offers does make sense in the meaning of satisfying basic human needs. What's its environmental impact and contribution to the world climate, how humane are working conditions, what's about distribution, and what's about democracy. And now the more important point, yes, the result has to be measurable and comparable. First, to bring full transparency on the whole story of a product to consumers and investors. And second, to allow policymakers, one more please, yes, to allow policymakers to link incentives to the result of the common good balance sheet. In order to, I mentioned it yesterday in the plenary sessions, today, the more sustainable, the more climate friendly, the more ethical and the more responsible products and services have higher prices on markets because they have higher costs. And the dumping products and services in all disciplines have a competitive advantage because they have lower prices because they externalize costs. And what the common good balance sheet would do with these incentives, it would invert this perverted relationship between the more responsible and the more sustainable and the less responsible and less sustainable products. I usually try to show this inversion or perversion of things in a short graph. It takes just 5 seconds. This is just to show that both ways are possible, and we have the free choice between capitalism and economy, thanks to Aristotle, to make this brilliant distinction. The opposite of economy is capitalism. If you go one further, same with banks, same with public procurement. Public procurers first ask for the ethical balance sheet, and only if this is green or red, only if this is green or yellow, the prices are compared. Banks first do the ethical risk assessment. And together these incentives cause the inversion of prices in favor of the sustainable ones. Yes, and maybe my last point is on the non-financial information directive of the European Union. There's a first version which applies in Germany, where are 4 million companies, and the EU directive on non-financial disclosure information applies to 300. You don't know what I don't know if you know what. So there's the financial balance sheet. It's legally binding. It has to be done by all major companies. It has to be audited externally by the financial auditor, and the result has legal consequences, from the tax duties to legal liability of the board members, and in Austria the company is shut down if it does not publish in 2 years a financial balance sheet. And our proposal is to do the same with the common good balance sheet, to integrate GRI, Global Compact, B Corps, Deutscher Nachhaltigkeitskodex, common good balance sheet to one legally binding standard that is holistic, that is measurable, that is comparable, that is audited externally by the common good auditors, and which result is linked to the incentives we talked about. Two more, and I think that's my last slide. Yes. In a metaphor, it would change the market rules. It's still a market economy. That's important. But it's not a market economy for profit-oriented and based on counter-petition, but it's a market economy based on common good orientation and cooperation. And maybe we just go through the slides in 1 second per slide to show the pictures. Can you continue? Yes. So it's a movement which has, and you can go on, which has spread to, and you can go on, has spread to 25 countries so far. It's including more and more municipalities. And yeah, maybe you stop in the next slide. Okay, and one more, please. And one more, please. Yes, and this is really my last slide, because there was an opinion from the European Economic and Social Committee on its own initiative, a 10-pager, and it invites the European Commission to include.
So what we can do on the 25th, what you are proposing there?
Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation, and I will come back to that question on my last point of my presentation. I did not really make a huge presentation, but anyhow, I think it's clear that there's nothing new. I mean, not starting with Aristotle, but it's also already in the Limits of Growth, the Club of Rome. It's also written in the book of Small and Beautiful of Schumacher, that we are indeed really on the wrong path in our economic system. But it's also not new that we have a degrowth conference in the European Parliament. I heard it several times as this is the first one. Well, it is not. It was already on the 16th of April 2009, where hosted by the Green Party, Bart Staes, still an MEP, together with a Flemish organization on sustainable development, the Club of Rome. It was 2009, where hosted by the Green Party, Bart Staes, still an MEP, together with a Flemish organization on sustainable development, the Club of Rome. It was called Socially Sustainable Economic Degrowth, and the place was full. Anyhow, why did the whole concept not really fly? I think one of the main reasons was that, apart from that it was new, we had a lot of reluctance from civil society organizations. And I'm also part of civil society organizations, so I'm blaming myself. If you feel blamed, then I'm also blaming myself as being part of it. I think trade unions were very reluctant in thinking about degrowth because they were, at that time, and I think still in the economic growth and jobs agenda. Development organizations were, they had a criticism on degrowth that if we start to consume less in the north, that means that we will buy less natural resources from the south, so that will mean less an MEP, together with a Flemish organization on sustainable development, the Club of Rome. It was called Socially Sustainable Economic Degrowth, and the place was full. Anyhow, why did the whole concept not really fly? I think one of the main reasons was that, apart from that it was new, we had a lot of reluctance from civil society organizations. And I'm also part of civil society organizations, so I'm blaming myself. If you feel blamed, then I'm also blaming myself as being part of it. I think trade unions were very reluctant in thinking about degrowth because they were, at that time, and I think still in the economic growth and jobs agenda. Development organizations were, they had a criticism on degrowth that if we start to consume less in the north, that means that we will buy less natural resources from the south, so that will mean less income for them. I'm not agreeing with this argument, but that was the argument that was given at that time. And the environmental movement was also not very happy because I think they were very happy at that time, and I think still a lot of mainstream organizations are still doing that they like to use the political correct concepts, which is the economic growth. So they are now totally into the green growth, sustainable growth, circular economy, all these kind of concepts embraced by the environmental movement, which is also going against, let's say, the whole logic behind what Christian, I think, explained very well, behind the degrowth thinking. I mean, the whole logic behind it. often I'm following a lot the UN process. I think there you see that for every environmental problem, there is a business opportunity. Climate change, great, business opportunity, more plastic in the ocean, and business opportunity for, the guy from Holland that invented, a big thing, I don't say so, but we're all in that narrative. Even if we are criticizing our model, I think we are still in a narrative of economic growth. So I think we have to be very consistent, and I really hope that after this day, the whole environmental movement also just stop talking about sustainable growth, green growth, circular economy, but that they really frame their narrative and their demands in the whole logic of the post-growth and degrowth thinking. Me, myself, I'm coming from the degrowth movement, let's say. So I did all the degrowth conferences, etc. But for me, it's a justice thing. It's not about the economic model is going wrong. Of course, it's going wrong. But for me, because I also worked a lot in the development world, developing world, for me, it's the reason that I'm very passionate about degrowth and post-growth is because of resource justice. We are over-consuming in the global north, and when I say the global north, it's also the elites in the global south, so it's not the north-south division as we often see it as well. And that, I think, is the main reason that we really have to decrease the natural resources that we are using in our economic system. So it's not a GDP discussion. Do I like GDP growth? Do I like the GDP indicator? No, that's kind of secondary. I think the main thing is that we have to organize our economic model, our consumption and production patterns in such a way that we, at least in Europe, because we're now talking about the European Union, that we only use the fair share of our natural resources and Earth. Also because of our overconsumption, a lot of poverty and conflicts we are causing in the global south, like mining, land grabbing, 4 environmental defenders killed per week. That's not because people like to kill environmental defenders because they don't like them. It's about the scarcity of the natural resources that we have. The pressure of land, of soil, of mining, of water is growing in such a way that people that are defending this are getting killed because of private interests. So for me, the whole discussion has to go about the whole system change. It has to go about other economic models, other business models, but also about totally other lifestyles, another concept on what work and labor is, etc. So this kind of things I think we have to debate as well, and not only about GDP growth, yes or no. I'm really happy that this debate is happening, of course, and I really, as I said, I hope that it will go on further. I signed the letter, but I did not agree with the proposals, talking about being inconsistent. Because I think that the 4 proposals that you saw in the paper that was handed out, I think they're also too much into silo thinking. It's about, again, having a commission on the post-growth future on the EU Parliament. I think we have, at this moment, a very good framework that was adopted in 2015, also by the European Union, also by all the member states of the European Union, which is called the 2030 Agenda, with the 17 goals, 169 targets, and I don't know how many indicators. So why try to find out, again, to invent the wheel again or the warm water, well, we have already such a thing. So I think if you really go for those 4 things, you are delaying again, instead of putting all your energy in really having those 2030 agenda implemented, not only in the EU, but also in all the member states. So I think that is very important. What is good, I think, is to have a think tank, like it was done in Germany with the Post-Wachstumsgesellschaft. I think it is important that economists and others, not only economists, it has to be a multidisciplinary team of scientists, make scenarios on how a post-growth or degrowth society would look like. So I think but that's something also for science to organize that, because I also see that we are dependent on our economic growth paradigm, because we pay our social system, our social security of it. So we have to find other ways to finance that. So it has to be a kind of guided degrowth in the global north. I think For Europe, I think what is important is that we put more emphasis and more focus on replacing the Europe 2020 strategy into a 2030 agenda. So that is really overarching, that those SDGs, sustainable development is the overarching goal, to have a strategy on that, to have a plan of implementation, to have also national strategies for sustainable development, and have ministers not only for economic transition, but for having ministers that are responsible for implementing the whole agenda of 2030. So all the SDGs, not only the economic one, but all of them, and make the linkages, because that is exactly the added value of the 2030 agenda. I'm not talking on behalf of SDG Watch because we don't have a position on post-growth, degrowth or whatever, but the demands I just gave are part of the demands of SDG Watch, which is now a coalition of more than 100 NGOs in Brussels and outside it. Next week, indeed, on the 25th of September, it's the International Day of Action on the SDGs. We will be there as SDG Watch, Friends of the Earth, many others, but we will also launch a manifesto. Because I don't know if you are aware, but Juncker's agenda with his 5 scenarios for the future of Europe, we wrote as civil society organizations a 6th scenario that was endorsed by many, many organizations. And based on that 6th scenario, we wrote now a manifesto which will help, I hope, the debate for the future of Europe, but also, of course, for the coming elections of the European Parliament. So I cannot give you more information on the manifesto. You have to wait until next Tuesday. Thank you very much.
I guess we all will be there, and we will cooperate with that, because we are discussing the European Parliament just now already the first draft of the multi-annual financial frame. And, for example, we are trying to include the benchmark of the 2030 agenda and the 17 aims into this MFF. So that will be the forthcoming debate and discussion we will have with the Council in particular, but also with the Commission, how to implement it and how to incorporate it there. So please, Mr. Koorte, the questions are all on the table, and I would ask you to give your views and maybe to answer the one or the other question already now, and then we can start with the discussion in the whole plenary.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Scholz, and thank you for inviting me for this important meeting. And many things have been said before me, so I think I can be, in fact, quite brief. I would like to make 4 points. But before doing so, just like to congratulate you and the organizers of this event with the perfect timing, because, as you said, we are, in fact, in the European Union at quite a junction, which will, we are in the last year of the Juncker Commission. We are preparing for what to do after 2019. The European parliamentary elections have been mentioned. The new multi-annual financial framework for post-2021. The financial crisis has been overcome to a certain extent. How do we now move on? So I think all these things will come together. And the Commission will obviously, in all its modesty, contribute to this. One thing that we would like to, what will happen is before the end of this year, the Commission will come with a reflection paper on the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals. A reflection paper which will, I think, be hopefully provide the basis for a debate what we are going to do after 2020, because we should not forget that, of course, the targets that have been mentioned by many, in a way, end in 2020. So the question is, what are we going to do afterwards? I don't think this question will be in any way answered by the current Commission, or I don't think the Commission will make too many proposals, since their mandate is over in a year, and it will therefore be for the next, I think, Parliament, the next Council, and also the next Commission to move this process forward. And hence, again, my point, this is a very good moment to talk about these important and complex issues. So I said 4 points, very briefly. Of course, the first point is that the official position of the European Commission and of the European Union, which I have the honor to present here today, is that there is no contradiction between growth and sustainability. This will be contested by many in this room. I understand it, but I have to be honest, I cannot beat about the bush on that point. That is the position. And that means that sustainable growth is, of course, at the center of everything that has been done by this Commission and has been largely shared by the Member States and by also, I think, by the European Parliament. Second point, I think, here is that we also need to realize that while the European Union is, compared to other parts of the world, a pretty good place to live and maybe even the best place to live, we have a number of very important challenges ahead of us. And it's very difficult to see how they can be really successfully addressed without there being some sustainable growth. Let me just mention the three main challenges. The first is, and a lot of important points were made by the Minister, I think, at the first we started this panel, is to achieve a socially inclusive growth and leaving no one behind. The second is upward convergence throughout Europe. That is between the Member States, in particular of welfare and well-being. And the third thing is that we have to ensure the sustainability of the model. And this also is responsible public finances. They are a very important part of the sustainability of the model. And if you then see at where we are on these three important points, the employment rate in the European Union is still not where we set out it to be in the 2020 strategy. We're about 72%. The aim is 75%. Youth employment in Greece is still very high, going down luckily. In the European Union it's 15%, which is also much too high. So there are very important challenges ahead of us, and surely GDP and growth are not the only answer, but without growth, I think it will be very difficult to achieve them. My second point, on the GDP issue, I agree very much with everybody who said this is a secondary discussion. The GDP is, of course, just a means, an indicator, and we have to distinguish between that and the goal, which is inclusive and sustainable growth. So we are certainly not, and in my DG Employment, we are not GDP fetishists at all. We see very, very well that this is a very limited concept that only grasps a certain part of the economic and social reality. That is why I think since 2009, in fact, many, many things have happened in the Commission. So I would contest all those who say that after the conferences that were mentioned in 2009 and after the resolutions and the Commission paper that nothing has happened. In fact, as recently as yesterday, Eurostat came out with its second report on the monitoring of the SDGs, which I can only recommend everybody to read. This gives, I think, as recently as last week in the State of the Union said, I want this pillar to get teeth. So we are implementing the pillar in various ways, which I will also come back to later. And one of the ways is that we have also established a social scoreboard, which is available for everybody, where we measure progress of the pillar in three. We want this pillar to get teeth. So we are implementing the pillar in various ways, which I will also come back to later. And one of the ways is that we have also established a social scoreboard, which is available for everybody, where we measure progress of the pillar in three major areas for all the member states. We measure progress and we compare them. And the social scoreboard is a very important tool. It's quite recent, but it shows that we're actually looking well beyond the GDP alone. And it's also an important instrument in the European semester process. Another way, and that's my third point, and implementing the social pillars is, of course, the legislation. We're working on, together with the Parliament and with the Council, on a very ambitious program to implement the pillar of social rights. I would like to mention three. In fact, there are 13 proposals, all of which is a very important tool. It's quite recent, but it shows that we're actually looking well beyond the GDP alone. And it's also an important instrument in the European semester process. Another way, and that's my third point, and implementing the social pillars is, of course, the legislation. we're working on, together with the Parliament and with the Council, on a very ambitious program to implement the Pillar of Social Rights. I would like to mention 3. In fact, there are 13 proposals, all of which we still want to get through the legislature before the elections. It's, again, very ambitious, but the 3 which I think stand out in today's discussion are the directive on work-life balance, to better combine work and family life, moves quite far into issues like parental leave and care, very controversial. You can imagine, difficult to find an agreement between the member states on an issue like that, but just mention it because it shows, I think, that we are going much further than the growth only. Secondly, another important proposal for a directive that should lay down minimum transparency and protection for workers, including those in precarious jobs. So here we are talking about the Ubers, the Deliveroo's, the people who have 0 contracts, 0-hour contracts, and who are in a way not at the moment able to qualify as a worker, and hence are excluded from many benefits. And that also brings me to the final point in terms of legislation. It's a recommendation that we put forward on better access to social protection. And my last point is on the international dimension. I'd just like to mention it so that it's not forgotten, that I think the European Union has also made a lot of progress over the last years in including sustainability questions in its trade agreements. Again, it's a controversial topic, and we probably may not agree on all the details, but I think, honestly, a huge effort has been made, and all our modern FTAs, such as with Japan, Mexico, Canada, have a substantial chapter on sustainability, trade and sustainability, with legally binding obligations, linking to the core labor standards of the ILO, and to a number of, I think there are 20 multilateral environmental agreements, which we try to also ensure through these bilateral agreements. Also in the autonomous regulations that we have adopted, Mr. Scholz remembers very well the work we have done together on the anti-dumping legislation. We actually built in that legislation, also under his leadership, a number of important references to the respect of labor rights and environmental protection rules by the countries that export to us. So I think I thought it was quite a fundamentally important opening in that legislation. So thank you very much. I hope that I've basically gave you an inventory of what we're doing, and I look forward to the discussion.
So thank you, and I would give Patrick the chance to wrap up maybe a little bit for the opening of the debate.
Okay, I regret having said yes to this. Okay, I will try not to repeat what everyone said, but I think what we've seen here is basically an overarching need for a wider transition, and the 4 speakers have focused on different aspects thereof. To move forward, there's not a single silver bullet, and what we've seen around the table is a range of different issues of smaller silver bullets, discrete actions, and so on. So I'd like to pick up one or two elements from each speaker. So what really touched me in the first one, in the Greece in going through the transition crisis, was the ability of actually including sort of social cohesion and social inclusiveness at the epicenter of that. So there is a crisis, and you can actually address the social dimension fundamentally to ensure citizens' well-being is at the heart of a transition. With Christian's common good, it was really good to see the well-being of citizens reiterated. It is our constitution, and it's good to remind that. And on the practice side, I thought what was particularly interesting was that there are more and more companies signing up to your basically your common good balance sheet. So that is a commitment to a practice which is expanding and expanding and expanding. Again, it's not going to address everything, but it's going to address something very useful. Later then, I thought she brought out a much wider picture then, saying it's not just environment, it's not just social. Let's remember the SDGs we've already committed. Let's commit some more. Let's actually make this commitment work. And I think that is a critical step and a practical step for the way forward. And then finally, Joost raised what we can do on the social dimension at a European level, and there was a range of different very positive steps in this, from the EU reflection paper, which I think will have to be a good one if we're not going to miss this opportunity. But I was also encouraged by not just the EU's pillar on social rights, but also the point on the sustainable development on trade, because I think that'll be a very tricky but also essential one. And our chair, Mr. Scholz, underlined the importance of being able to integrate SDGs into one of the major levers of this commission, that is the multi-annual financial framework. So what we've had is we've had the environmental dimension, we've had the social dimension at 2 levels, we've had the wider picture, and we've had half a dozen or even probably 24 practical steps that have been raised. So then coming here now with, this is a partial picture, but already a good representation of the complexity. So then the debate is how we can move forward. What are other initiatives that people can carry? What are the visions, the practical visions, but also the real actions that will allow us to actually make the transition? Because basically we live in a system, one system with a series of lock-ins, and it requires a systems thinking and a systems change over a 20, 30-year period to be able to realize the social ambitions, the true ambitions of well-being as citizens, which is also democratic responsibility of government, and at the same time living within the planet's boundaries, which are basically not getting any bigger despite the economy and population getting bigger. So anyways, just to wrap it up, I thought we've created a good picture, but also do have a look. I think Leida made a point that the petition which is out there for the 238 scientists signed is limited. It doesn't address all the problems. Again, it is an attempt at a silver bullet. Do read it. If you like it, sign up to it. But of course, it's not going to be the answer to everything. And then who moves forward on what will depend on exactly your position is. But we need to move together and coordinated with a common vision and encouraged by each other's practice. So I'll stop there and hand it back to the chair.
Thank you. And I would ask Nick to introduce just to the slide questioning. Maybe you can explain so that we are really creating a certain picture during the next 1 hour and 15 minutes. We have time for this debate.
Thank you, Helmut. I don't know if you can read it from the stage up there, but on the screen you see the questions that people have been asking. If they are too little, maybe I'll just start from the top with the question and then see where we go. So the top question with 2 votes now is, people are voting, to Minister Efi from Greece. How is the perspective on post-growth? Can you imagine that an uncontrolled recession, as you probably had, is different from a planned degrowth pathway? That's a question for you. There is a similar question to you. How could you bring into this picture a non-dependence from the growth? I'm afraid that's not been on the IMF's agenda. So maybe we just go from there. So the question was, how is the perspective on post-growth in Greece? Can you imagine that an uncontrolled recession, or one that was controlled by the Troika maybe, is different from a planned degrowth way, a planned post-growth pathway? Can you see that possible? Another question to you was, can you do something with the economy of the common good that Christian talked about in the Greek cabinet? Can you lobby to make a well-being budget, for example, instead of just a financial budget, as New Zealand is doing right now?
Okay. So, as I've tried to describe during my initial statement, the main pillar of our growth strategy, let's start from a different beginning. The Greek government has, for the first time, designed a very specific growth strategy for the future. It is a document that includes our main priorities for the years to come and how we expect growth to be, let's say, sustainable and socially fair, because that's the title of the growth we are looking for: sustainable and socially fair growth. So this is a strategy that has been drafted by the Greek government. It concerns the years to come, the next 5 to 10 years. It has a very specific table of means and of goals. That's why I think that our view of the growth strategy is quite close to what Christian described. You can definitely see it. It is a public document, and you'll see that we have the priorities in different sectors, and then at the end of this document there is a table that says the means to achieve them. And it describes a number of fiscal means and other elements and other tools that we could use in order to reach the goals that we describe in the first section of the document. This growth strategy, I am underlining this because it's the first time that actually Greece has a very specific plan, a very specific strategy for growth, to which we are all committed, let's say. It has been discussed in the Greek Parliament. It has been presented at the Eurogroup. So in a way, it is something that everybody, all key players, know about, what we are planning to do. So in this growth strategy, we have, let's say, 3 pillars. The first pillar is labour. So labour is something completely different from the social state or the welfare state, and this is quite important because until now the support of the labour force has been addressed as an element of the welfare state or the social state. So the view of the previous governments was that first the wealth is produced, then we'll see how we'll distribute it. While our view is that the wealth to be produced, we need to enhance labour, to increase wages and to support labour rights, and we discuss the distribution at the same time that we are discussing the production of wealth. Distribution and production go together. So this is the first pillar and the most important of the growth strategy. The second one is the management of public finances. As the representative of the Commission stated, this is quite important for us that we have stable public finances, that we know how to deal with them in the future. And the third pillar is the social state. So how we create all the nest that is necessary in order for the majority of the Greek population to be supported and to be sure that we do not go back to the path that led us to the crisis. These are all the 3 pillars, main pillars, that are included in our growth strategy for the future. So now that we have started to see positive signs of growth in the economy, we have a stable strategy for the future that, if everybody will follow it, because that's what we are committed to do, will not again lead us to a path that led us to crisis, will not again take us back to the path that led us to the crisis. And we are expecting that this will be a model of fair and sustainable growth. Fair because the wealth that is produced is distributed to the majority. Sustainable because it is based on where the country has its competitive advantages, not in a race to the bottom with regard to the labour standards, but on emphasising in the labour force and in the enhancement of the protection of the workers.
Thank you. I would give the floor then to Leida, because there is a question how to cope with the SDG goal of growth and jobs. Just ignore it or reframe it to jobs and let the growth aside.
Yeah, that was always a difficult one, that SDG, but I think that was the consensus we had to make. It was even, I think it started with sustainable growth when we were doing the negotiations on the SDG, and it ended up with sustained growth, which was even worse. I think there are a lot of countries in the world that still need growth. I mean, that's why I'm a little bit to say, well, we don't need growth anywhere. I think there are a lot of developing countries that still need growth, or at least need to consume more, I mean, collectively to raise until the bottom line, let's say, of the basic needs. So I think it's not being against growth, against all odds. I mean, you have to see where it is. But I think if it's one of the 17 goals, so it's not the only one, so you cannot only focus on growth and then see what happens with the other ones. I mean, as it is a package, it's 17 goals or nothing. It's a whole package. I think it's fine that it's there, and you just see if it's necessary or not. If you're in a country like us in our region where we don't need more growth, then I think we can ignore it and focus on all the 17 in one package.
Okay. Right.
Christian.
Can I just respond to that, to add another area, because I think it's probably quite useful to try to distinguish between aspects of growth and jobs, because I think it could be useful to work out where the growth is necessary or useful and where degrowth is necessary and useful. So clearly, and it links into the labor issue, so if you do talk about agroecological practices, they are much more labor intense and better for the environment, and also good often for the farmers, so you can have growth in sustainable agriculture and food system, degrowth in intensive agriculture. Similarly with renewables, it's the same thing. If you look at the number of jobs from wind, from PV, you can have growth in that, but degrowth and disinvestment from coal and oil. And similarly, if you look at sort of products on the market which affect a lot of our children, there's a lot of toxic chemicals in them. We can have degrowth of the toxicity and move to a non-toxic environment, and then you can have a growth in that and a degrowth in the toxic elements. And similarly, I think someone else yesterday morning mentioned, growth, you can have research and understanding. We can commit to growth there. We can have, as Christian said, we can have growth in well-being as an objective. And so I think that's the way of looking at the degrowth issue, is where can we grow, where can we degrow, and have it as a practical level. And also the other issues, of course, degrowth in inequity issues and so on. So that's the way I would reply. So don't take it off the table, don't ignore it, but reframe it in a constructive way that allows people to engage in the positive transition.
Christian?
One short comment to the SDG, one short comment to Greece and your growth strategy, and then to the core. The SDG as they are today, they are a compromise or a consensus of governments. I'm 100% sure that if the citizens would have consensus on the SDG, GDP growth would not be in. All scientific research indicates that people desire something else than monetary income or GDP measurement. There are two representative surveys in Germany and UK that almost 3/4 of the population of both countries would prefer the replacement of the GDP by a gross national happiness or a common good product. These are representative surveys, they're just not implemented. The very short question to the Greek minister would be if an absolute decoupling of GDP growth and environmental resource use is a precondition that you consider your strategy as successful. It's a short question. And now to the core confusion, because I'm answering now to the representative of the Commission, because I think there's still a confusion at the core, and that's decisive and relevant, and that's why I'm very unsatisfied, because we seem to talk about similar ideas, but actually we are not. And what's the confusion in the core? It is that you say that GDP growth is no fetish and it's no goal. That's what you said literally. And then the only thing I appreciate, you stressed that it's the official position of the Commission. So I guess that your personal position is different, and this makes me a bit hope. But I'm now talking about the official position of the Commission. And if you say that the official position is that it's no goal, then, and the goal is inclusive and sustainable growth, then again, it's in the goal, and it's not only in the goal, it's the only noun in the goal, because inclusive and sustainable are adjectives, and growth is the only noun. If somebody checks the Commission, if it has complied with its legal duty to fulfill this goal, it has to prove that it has made the GDP grow as the first and foremost goal still. So And I ask, why couldn't it be inclusive and sustainable well-being instead of inclusive and sustainable growth? For three reasons. First, scientifically, because please give us counter evidence. The whole evidence I know is that there is no decoupling of GDP growth and absolute resource consumption has been achieved anywhere. Please give us the counter evidence and don't tell us that there is no contradiction between sustainability and growth. Second, politically, show me any constitution that says that crematistics or capitalism is the goal of the economy. It isn't. So it's anti-constitutional and it's democratically not legitimated that GDP growth is part of the goal of any policy. I think it's not legitimized. And strategically, my contradiction is, if inclusive and sustainable well-being includes full employment, includes workers' rights and human rights, includes fair distribution of income, includes sound environment, includes social inclusion and cohesion, why bother about GDP? Why? It is a fetish. If you have everything you want to achieve, you have achieved. Why still bother about GDP? It's just not logical. So it's even unlogical, and nothing more.
Joost.
Okay. Well, my personal views, I think, don't really matter here, but that's not why why you invite me. I think I have said, I think, that that growth is clearly one of the goals that we have in the European Union, without any doubt. You say it's maybe anti-constitutional. I say, show me any government that says something else than what I've just said now. So all the governments in Europe are then maybe unconstitutional. I am confronted with the facts, what is being said and what is being agreed at the highest levels of the European Union, and all these people have been democratically elected. So that, for me, the legitimacy is not at stake. I've also said that that growth is not the only indicator, and that's why I said we're not fetishist, and certainly not if you measure growth only with GDP. There are many other, and then I gave you a lot of examples of how we measure our European societies on other bases than GDP. All the examples I gave are not about GDP, and the social pillar is not about GDP. The official policy framework of the European Commission is much more nuanced than only GDP. So I don't know where you have this idea that we are only focusing on growth and on GDP. It's just not true. And I think this is where I think my position is, we may not agree, but I think the position that I have is probably also a coherent one.
The tiny, or one sentence, or not one sentence? To the moderator. Yeah, okay. I didn't say that's the most important goal. That's what I said. Of course, you have hundreds of goals, but which is the most important? And example, CETA, the debate on CETA, just one example, which is the most important goal. The first and most important argument why CETA is a good idea is because it makes GDP grow. It's the first and most relevant and most important out of your 25 goals. Is it true or not?
Just a moment. Just Mrs. the Minister of Labour also want to include before we are going to the Commission again.
Yeah. Just on this issue, but from a different, let's say, perspective. In my view, this is something that I would also like to pose to the Commission. There is a gap between the rhetorics of the European Union on social rights and the realities. And we have to address this. We have to see it. So at the same time that there are a number of initiatives at the European Union level, at the level of declarations that show that the European Union and the institutions are very much concerned about the socially balanced growth the social inclusive growth, the social indicators, or the social rights. I will not be in more details. I think that everybody understands here what I'm talking about. At the same time, the policies that are applied, and in the majority of the situations they are prescribed by the Commission, are the ones that, let's say, they are towards suppressing the labour costs. This would not only mean suppressing wages, it will also mean suppressing rights. So we have to face it, that there is a gap between the declarations and the reality. At the same time that the pillar of social rights was signed and voted by the head of states in Gothenburg, at the same time the European Commission in Greece insisted so much on not restoring collective bargaining in the country. And everybody who knows a little bit about these mechanics understands that collective bargaining is a way to distribute more equally, fairly, the wealth that is produced. It's a way that the workers can ask and gain higher wages, better conditions of employment. So there is this contradiction. There is this contradiction between the rhetorics and the reality. At the same time that we are talking today here, and I hear this very nice this position that I totally agree with from the representative of the Commissioner. At the same time, yesterday I received an email from the Commission saying that they do not agree that we are planning to increase the minimum wage in Greece. And how is that possible? And why do we not inform them? And what exactly are we planning to do? And that this could touch upon the growth rates, and that this could touch upon a number of key indicators of the Greek economy that are very important, and that this could be very dangerous, and that we could go back to the path of recession, and that what about this collective bargaining thing that we are doing there, and what about... So, you see, this is just one example. This is just one example of what I have been at least personally experiencing in the last 3 years. This is something that I've raised at the ministerial councils as well. The ministers of labour of the European Union, we gather and we say all these very nice things about social protection, the social indicators, the social scoreboard, but at the same time, the policies that are implemented, let's face it, they are decided by the Eurogroup. They are decided by the Eurogroup, do not take into account the social implications of the number of policies that concern the monetary union. A number of policies that are implemented in order to deepen the monetary union do not take into account, we are not even talking about addressing the two values as equal. I'm saying that the monetary policies do not even take into account the social implications. So we have at some point to see this contradiction between the rhetorics and the reality. And I think that the European Commission needs at some stage to realize this and to look at it clearly. We cannot discuss about how important labour market institutions are and then at the same time prescribe recipes at countries in crisis that dismantle core labour rights with the persistence of the Commission. We have to face this.
Thank you, Mr. Koorte. You want to answer to both of these contributions?
I think on the gap between rhetoric and reality, sure. I mean, I find it difficult to contest what you say, but I would also want to caution against making the Greek situation sort of the litmus test of everything that we are doing. You are in a very special situation, and luckily you're now out of it. And I think one of the tasks that I see there is to help you in creating, a modern economy according to the principles that you have set out yourself very eloquently, but also to avoid that the mistakes that were made in the past when you were not in the government are repeated. So I think this is where, understandably, not me, but I wasn't even aware of this letter you got yesterday. It didn't come from us, but that in the Commission and surely shared by the Eurogroup, pushed by the Eurogroup, there is a desire to be kept informed that Greece does not make what I would really call errors that have been made, which got you into this awful situation that you have described, and which has brought all these terrible things on the country. I mean, I go to Greece a lot, and I can only agree very much with everything you say, and the situation has become pretty dramatic under this austerity program. I mean, what we do broader is, as I try to explain, and as my president always says, making a non-binding declaration is easy, with 20 principles that everybody can adhere to. Nobody will contest any of the principles in the social pillar, but it gets very complicated in the European Union when you then want to implement them. And there you have a point, and I'm the first also to suffer from this. I go to the member states in the Koorte, and I go to the Parliament, and there's a lot of opposition against these. The moment you want to give it teeth, but we're trying. But the European Commission is not, when it comes to legislation, not all that power. We make a proposal, and we need to have a QMV, a qualified majority vote, in favor. Otherwise, it doesn't pass. That's the reality that I'm confronted with. But on all both on the legislation and also on the funding arrangement that we have put in place, on the European Social Fund and the other structural funds, there is a clear political commitment to translate the principles of the pillar into the reality, and also in the European semester. So I think the picture is, as I said, as always in the European Union, it's not easy, and it's a hugely complex organization, but it's never black and white.
Thank you. We got the question to the panel maybe. How we will be able to finance the aging costs, the necessary public infrastructure, social and energy investments without GDP growth and growing tax income. So, I mean, the reality we have. And I would add here as one question, if we are speaking about the stakeholders, the subjects who are realizing the policy, we have just left out until now the problem of the financialization of the economy. That means we have different actors, and not only the producing actors, so the real and material goods understanding of growth, but we have to come to the financial market as well, and that has, of course, a very deep impact on the question we are dealing with the growth and degrowth challenges. Christian?
Yeah. 3 concrete proposals. First, private wealth is 5 times public debt in the Eurozone. So we could use a small part of that. Second, free movement of capital, which only to third countries, which came in 1994 as an addition to the Maastricht Treaty, has to be coupled to full tax cooperation and transparency. If not, there is no free movement of capital to avoid and to eliminate tax flight. And this has to be in the primary treaties. This is now not the fault of the European Commission. This is the fault of the drafters and architects of the European treaties. These are our governments who misinterpret their own constitutions. I agree that you can interpret it differently, but I think it's a misinterpretation to allow that as the highest policy goal GDP is used. And I think it's a misinterpretation of the Constitution that you allow free movement of capital to third country without tax cooperation. And the third is that the European Central Bank becomes a democratic institution which participates in the funding of public debt up to, let's say, a maximum of 50% of GDP. Public debt is financed with credits from the central bank. Interest-free, and I don't just know the figures for Germany. For Germany, this would release an annual amount of between 30 and 50 billion euros. We could use this amount of money for the proposed kind of necessary public investments, but linking them to a common good exam or to a sustainability exam, meaning that they are only done if they contribute to an absolute degrowth of resource consumption.
Leila?
Yeah, well, I think I agree in everything you say. I think it's indeed very important to shift the whole taxes. I mean, we have to have the money for the public infrastructure, and that's exactly what I said. Also, the reason that a lot of organizations or stakeholders are against it, because we don't really know what's happening. We also don't know what's happening with the 3% growth of the Lisbon strategy, I have to admit, because that's also not calculated. How many resources do we need for that growth? We also don't know. But I think if there would be more emphasis put on calculating how this degrowth or post-growth, whatever you want to call it, a scenario would look like, indeed then also mostly with the main reason or the main objective is to increase, at least in the European region, the use of natural resources. But I think that's why I think it is a good idea to have this kind of think tank of people, not only economists, but others as well, to see what's going to happen in this planned degrowth scenario, which is absolutely necessary. But I still think that we are mixing goals and means. I mean, if you say, are we against or in favor of the GDP growth, then I think, yes, we are totally against it, because this is just the wrong indicator. It doesn't show what we want, because it also includes cleaning environmental damage, all the people with stress, all the health costs and so on, because it's all good for the GDP growth. If you talk about, let's say, what Patrick wants to do, I think, on growing some sectors like organic farming or non-toxic toys or whatever, then I think it's good to talk about increasing those sectors on the account, of course, on the poisoning sectors, but not maybe call it economic growth or not growth. I mean, because I think it's something goes wrong in growth, because even if we have everything eco-designed in a very environmental friendly way, I don't think that we can still keep on consuming those. So there is limits of consumption. So that's why we wrote the publication on sufficiency. I mean, it's somewhere you have to stop consuming, because everything that you do needs energy of resources. I mean, so, and I think there are limits there if we want to be a little bit fair with our planetary boundaries.
As Mr. Koorte has informed me that he has to leave in before, I would put the final question to you. Do you think that the Commission, even if the Commission would be ready to include a non-GDP growth indicator, but others, into the legislative proposals you make to the Council and to the Parliament, you as a Commission would be able to interpret the treaties in this direction, would be able to survive, or do you think that the Council would kill the Commission with such an approach, and by that ignoring a certain sum of experiences, of debates we have in the society?
Well, I mean, this is part of the debate, I think. That's why I'm interested to listen to you, and I'm really triggered by many things that have been said by the audience and by you, and I think I cannot rule out any such initiative. I mean, and the fact that it may never be adopted, I mean, that's in a way not decisive. Not all the Commission proposals are adopted, but they can also be there to trigger a real political debate at the level of the Council, where these decisions are taken. And it's not the Council that the Minister goes to, as she rightly said. The real power is not there, of course. The real power is in very often in the Treasuries and in the ECOFIN Council and the Eurogroup. It will be hard to convince them, I think, but this is a good start, I would say. And as I said, I think if I speak only for my own house, which I know a bit, the European Commission, the services of the European Commission, there is a lot of thinking going on about all these issues, and it's not that we are there the force that at all costs want to keep this conservative, what you would regard as conservative approach at all. I think that's why I mentioned the reflection paper. Okay, it's only a reflection paper, but these issues will have to be addressed. And there will be a new Commission. And there is a chance, of course, what the new Commission will look like will depend on the elections. And there I am looking at how the elections go in the Member States. There's a lot of reason for concern. But okay, that's how the democracy works. I was also triggered by something else that Mr. Felber said, and I would just like, if you allow me to come back to this, your common goods balance sheet, which is, I think, also a very good initiative. And in the meantime, I checked this with my help of my colleagues, and there is actually a proposal on the table, which was put forward, I think, in May of this year. It's not entirely the same, but it is very much in the same philosophy. It's introducing, if I understand correctly, this is not my file, an EU classification system of sustainable economic activities, taxonomy. And it would require the disclosure requirements. It would include disclosure requirements for institutional investors on environmental, social, and economic governance issues as part of their risk assessment. So I think it was very close to what you have in mind. I mean, I will look into this a bit closer when I have the time to see. I think it's a legal proposal. And finally, I owe you an answer on the CETA. On CETA, because I dealt a lot with that issue and I suffered a lot under the CETA. Of course, one of the drivers of removing obstacles to trade is, of course, growth, without any doubt. But this is, again, part of the discussion. There's also a lot of other things. And I think nowadays the debate on that has shifted a lot. I think nowadays, if I read the situation well, the justification of these agreements is much more multilateralism, sharing values, and addressing the challenges which are brought about by Mr. Trump and his administration. I accept, of course, this came later. But I think now we can be very happy that we have these agreements and that we are pursuing another agenda, which is, by no means perfect. But, I mean, if I compare that agenda and those FTAs and everything we do in the European Union with what's happening elsewhere in the world, I'm glad that I'm here.
One short question, because Mr. Koorte has to leave.
Thank you very much. My name is Jan Juffermans. I'm chair of the Dutch Platform for a Fair and Green Economy. I have a question to you. But before that, I think our planet is in trouble. Humankind is in trouble. So we need a strategy from top down and bottom up. And we are in Holland very enthusiastic about the models of Kate Raber's for the analysis and the bottom-up approach for companies and municipalities with the common good economy. We are working in Brabant with the first group and companies to start with it. But to you, I have a question from Barroso. Barroso organized a big meeting, 2007, Beyond GDP, and he mentioned the footprint. And the footprint is about fair sharing, about a fairer share. And if all Europeans would live if all people on the earth would live like us, we need 3 to 4 planets. So footprint justice and climate justice are so important now to share the planet. So how can you include this in your discussions? It's a matter of human rights. I hope you recognize this from this 2007 appeal by Barroso. We have to use new indicators. So how we use these indicators? So I think, Rijnhout called it also human rights issue. Is it ever on the table? Is this a global human rights issue?
Yes, it is on the table. And I think if you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, that issue that you bring up now is there. I mean, I was a bit disappointed when I saw the Eurostat paper, which you should still read there because it's interesting and extremely well done, very clear. I was a bit disappointed that 4 of the goals, including justice, strong institutions, peace, climate action, and life below water, are not covered by this. So I think we have a shortage there. I don't think I would contest in any way your reasoning, and I would be completely behind it. But to make it operational, this is the trick, and this is what I find the challenging question if you work for a public administration. How do we then make that real in the political reality in which we are working? That is, I think, the trick. And there I really look forward to, as many concrete ideas that as you have. And I think the pressure coming bottom up is probably, I hope, more hopeful than the one top down.
We will discuss this afternoon also about rationing and quotas.
There's a question from the room.
Yes, I would like to, Tim Perik from the researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center, I would want to try to clear a misunderstanding among the panel about what degrowth is. And you said for different reasons that GDP is a secondary issue, and that's exactly what degrowth is saying, that GDP as an indicator is really the tip of an iceberg, of a broader logic which we refer to as the ideology of growth. And here we're talking about extractivism, we're talking about productivism, about this systemic logic of commodification and planned obsolescence and productivism and consumerism and all those things. So here I want to come back to the origin of the word degrowth, which is in French décroissance. And so we cannot use degrowth as a verb in the sense of like the economy can grow or degrow. No, the economy can be in economic growth or can be in recession or depression, right? So in French, like it's not décroître, decrease, it's décroire in the sense of unbelief. So that was the origin of the word, to unbelieve in the religion or ideology of growth. And here, like, so when we're talking here, it's not about selection of different sectors that just should shrink and just like expand. It's really about like a re-embedding, a broader re-embedding of that thing we call the economy, which right now is defined by the supremacy of financial incentive over social and moral world, to re-embed this in society and, of course, in the environment. So here, my call is really like, let's not ignore GDP because we think, it's a little piece of ice floating on the water. We should be aware that this is the top of a larger iceberg and concentrate the discussion not on the indicator, not on the side of the economy that expand or shrink, but on this overall logic of economy and the economic and its role in society.
Yeah.
I think I agree. I cannot agree more with that. I mean, it's what I said as well. I mean, it's also changing the whole narrative. I mean, we, even as environmental movement or others, we are also kind of locked in this thinking. I mean, it has to be bigger and so on. That's why I said, well, let's not talk anymore about green growth or sustainable growth because it's still in that growth paradigm. So it's not only about the GDP. The reason and why we still use degrowth, I mean, we as, let's say, the degrowth movement, is that a lot of other words that we used before on sustainable development and all these kind of things were captured by business, and degrowth is the only word that will never be captured by business or government. So that's why it's a kind of the profile that it is. But I mean, it's Jeroen van den Berg. He's an economist now in Barcelona, and he's very against the word degrowth because he said, well, the GDP indicator sucks. I mean, that's what he says. I think even the title of his book. So I think that's he said, well, if you use the word degrowth or post-growth, you're still referring to that GDP indicator. And if you're not agreeing with an indicator, then you don't need to have a movement around that indicator. So, but I think that's a lot of semantics as well. But I think the degrowth movement is exactly what you say. It's about a lot more than the GDP indicator. It's about having totally different lifestyles and totally different concept of work, tax shifts, all these kind of things are in it. So I think, and that's exactly what it should be.
Let's change shortly and then back to the floor.
Yes, would like to pick up the human rights issue and the broader picture and the answer from the European Commission that we are a public administration and we need proposals. Proposals are on the table, they're just ignored. No? One of the proposals that are on the table is, for instance, a carbon dioxide, a carbon tax in the European Union of $100 per ton, and an additional carbon tariff towards all trade partners that do not have the same carbon tax. That very easy, very convincing proposal. It's on the table. It's just ignored. Direct democracy. My answer to what about asking the citizens what's the well-being of us, what's a good life, was not answered. I'm afraid the Commission is not really interested in the opinions and values and needs of the citizens. In Munich, a referendum initiated by the citizens led to the closure of a coal power plant. That's a solution, direct democracy as a solution. And the human rights issue, I think the economic science could be a solution in its own definition, which is the efficient management of scarce resources. Asking which is the most relevant scarce resource at the moment, it's the planet. Picking up the planetary boundaries from the Stockholm Resilience Center, picking up the donut from Kate Rayworth, who elaborates on that. To me occurred something that occurred to others as well, which I call ecological human rights. So if the scarce resource is the planet, and the planet gives us this amount of biological resources, we could divide these resources by 8 billion humans, and this is what we are allowed to consume. Or personalization, we could talk about it. I think it's already possible. And this is using economic science to efficiently and also fairly manage scarce resources, respecting the principle of equality, equal rights for the living humans, and same equal rights for our children and grandchildren. It's a proposal is also on the table, and it's also ignored by the public administration, which is searching for practical solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Alini.
Thank you very much. It's a question also to Leila with regard to the degrowth, and I don't want to stick too much on the semantics, but I think I'm totally with you when it concerns the question of preserving natural resources. But I think there's one area where we have growth on the global scale now. That is the growth in population. So if you take Africa, for example, we have there an increase of demand of goods and resources. So there is an increase maybe of growth as well. But we have to see quite correctly where it stems from. It stems from the poverty in the region, in Africa or in Asia, and therefore the question, to my mind, rather goes, shouldn't we have a fairer trade policy, for example, to Africa? Shouldn't there be a fairer distribution of goods, which we have? But I just want to make clear, growth is going to be, at least in one part there, if you look to the birth rate in the less developed countries in comparison to the developed countries. So I think we have to have a fairer distribution of goods which are there in order to solve this situation, because in the long run, as we said, we don't have 3, 4, 5 worlds. It's a question of distribution of goods. Thank you.
Yes, of course, we do have population growth, and I think that's also something we have to deal with and to talk about, because it's still a taboo. I don't have the solutions here, but I think it is something we have to discuss as well, although not today. But if it's about having, let's say, a lot of people in the south, I mean, and then I think still we are winning in our consumption rates. I mean, a child from Holland consumes maybe 10 or 20 times more than a child from Afghanistan, and we are talking about pressure on the planet. So I think we are still more to blame. And even here in Europe, we have policies which promotes us to have more kids. In Belgium, you get more money the more kids you have. So I think that's something that is totally in contrast in what would be, let's say, responsible. But I think what you also see is that our lifestyles, our unsustainable lifestyles, are totally based on the natural resources of the South. I mean, if not totally, then mainly. So I think there, indeed, is a question of redistribution, and that's why we have SDG 10, on equality. And I think that's also the reason why I'm quite involved in this movement, because I think that's for me the main reason. Because now you see in the Global South, and I was there often, you see that a lot of communities and people, they just can't develop, let's say. They can't reach the basic needs. They're confronted with a lot of environmental damage, not only in the mining things, but it's also in the land grabbing, it's in the oil exploitation, it's everywhere. It's using whole continents as an experiment for the green revolution so that the Monsantos can get rid of their GMOs and pesticides and fertilizers. So I think this is all, for me, part of the degrowth debate.
Thank you. The man behind, and then you.
Yeah, maybe you take several questions at the row, so we can be more, have more people asking questions. It's just a suggestion. Have more questions in a row.
Yeah, we can.
I just have a comment to do with the 2030 agenda. Excuse me. And getting behind the 2030 agenda rather than doing something new. Of course, at the heart of the 2030 agenda is the Sustainable Development Goals. But the problem is, at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals is economic growth. If you've had any doubt, economic growth is mentioned 17 times. I'll give a few examples here. To promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth. That's Goal 8. Clause 66, we recognise that domestic resources are first and foremost generated by economic growth. And then, just as an example of trade, international trade is an engine for inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction. So the whole of the SDGs, at the core, is economic growth. So it's difficult for quite a few people to get behind the SDGs because it's not a post-growth project. And it's probably, I don't think that necessarily, I would have been amazed if it actually turned out to be a post-growth project. I don't think it would at all. But that's also the situation we're in now. And of course there are pragmatists that would say to try and work and do the best within that, but then it doesn't feel very good to some people that you're actually participating in a project which is not a post-growth one.
Thank you. Here's a question, yeah.
Yes. Yefim Fogel, University of Leeds. There was a lot of talk about goals, and I quite agree with Christian Felber's clarifications. But then, as we see with the SDGs, like there's 17 goals and then 150 sub-goals, so that's kind of easy to include everything that makes everyone happy there. But I guess politics is about decisions in the end of the day, and that's, I guess, about value judgments, as Clive Splash pointed out yesterday, or about priorities. So I'd like to challenge, in particular, the three panelists in the middle to give your priorities and ideally be somewhat accountable for them. And I'll give you 4 to choose from, and I'd like you to put them in your order of priority. So that would be justice, well, I mean environmental and social justice, not only within the EU but global. Then ecological sustainability, meeting basic human needs, and monetary wealth. If you could give us your priorities of 1, 2, 3, 4, among those 4 values or goals, that would be great. Thank you.
Slider question. Should be a slider.
The 3 in the middle only? Well, I'm happy for you to reply as well. I think
just
I
asking.
Have an idea of your... Yeah.
You name those you want an answer from.
Okay, your answer as well, please.
The lady there.
Hello. Yes. I would like to add something to the question of how are we going to finance the transformation we need. I am Katrin Latsch from Germany. I am the speaker of a network for monetary diversity. And I would be interested in the question if the European Parliament does cooperate with the ECB. I am asking that because, well, we are with GDP growth dependent on this measurement. It's always measured in euros, and we are sort of dependent on this one euro system, and maybe it would stabilize this euro system. I'm afraid we will experience another euro crisis, maybe not too soon from now. And we should think about different means of exchange. I would like to give you an example. At the moment, we have a very interesting new technological development, which is the blockchain. Of course, it would be possible to have sort of a green crypto euro. And this could be linked to the SDGs. So you would have means for exchange which would finance these SDG goals. And I would like to know if maybe the European Parliament or the Commission, for example, could ask the ECB to do research and a study on that question.
Thank you. One more, and then we make the next round. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm very disturbed. It seems to me that the main speakers and many of the other speakers yesterday have missed the point. We cannot avoid dramatic degrowth. It is impossible for everybody alive today to live as we do in the West. As was said earlier, it would require 5 backup planets to do it. From a physics point of view, it's impossible. You get energy from one place, you consume it, it appears somewhere else. You use the energy to process materials, you dig them up, they don't go away, they appear in the stratosphere as space debris. It cannot be done. It cannot be done. Full stop. The question is, what so the conclusion is that a sustainable society will have to be as different from our society as an industrial society was from an agricultural society. And just as no one in an agricultural society could envisage what an industrial society would look like, so no one in our society can envisage what a sustainable society will look like. It's coming. The question is, what institutional arrangements can we put in place to help us move to a different kind of society that we cannot envisage, of which there can be no blueprint? What institutional arrangements can we put in place to promote evolution? That is the question.
So, shortly.
Thank you. Noé Lecoq from Inter-Environnement Wallonie. Just two short questions. One to Leida, Rijnhout. I come back on this SDGs, and I was really pleased with your introduction, saying that environmental NGOs should be consistent in their narrative. I'm from an environmental NGO, and we have that problem of a politically correct concept. And I was really surprised when you shifted to that conclusion that the framework of SDG was very good because it's a green growth, politically correct SDGs, and it has a lot of contradiction that was mentioned. It is used we can ignore it, but it is used by Business Federation in Belgium to promote growth. They have the nice logo of SDGs on their publication, and they say we aim to sustainable growth, and that's used in Belgium, in Europe. There is also the fact that industrial production is one of the targets, so you cannot at the same time promote decoupling and more material productivity. So I was surprised by your answer on that, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. And also more broader context, we've seen yesterday with Wolfgang Münchow from the Financial Times. He said we should change the language. We should be very careful which language we use to talk about degrowth. And we see in these 2 days it's difficult to have the debate in the political sphere, but maybe we should, as a first step, increase the debate in the mediatic, in the public sphere. And how could we better have a better echo of this debate around well-being, about post-growth, with journalists and make the story pass to the wider public before reaching for the politicians, because the politicians will follow if there is a debate in the society. They will not initiate the debate.
Thank you. So I would give the floor back to the panel. I will start with you, Leila, and that we are trying to finish in 10 minutes so that 10 minutes are left for maybe a last round of questions and answers.
Thank you. I totally agree that the 2030 agenda is not a post-growth project. I mean, I'm even very against the slogan, and I'm the only one, I think, in whole SDG Watch, leave no one behind. Because that also gives that growth paradigm. I mean, we all have to go in the train of development, and then we have to leave no one behind. And the only thing we leave behind is this whole destructed planet. So I'm just against that slogan. I just say it again. But anyhow, people use it, and I have to kind of agree to that. But it is true. So why do I use that framework? Because I think still, and maybe that's naive, but I still think for me it's also an instrument. It's not a goal. It's an instrument, and it's an instrument that's now on the table we can use, and I think as civil society we can use it in our right way. It's the same with any other instrument. Like a hammer, I mean, you can put a nail in the wall, but you can also kill someone with it. So I think an instrument is an instrument, and I think we as civil society, we have the obligation to use it in a way as we think it is useful. And it's something that is, let's say, adopted on a global level. So it's something, but I have to admit, I will see it for 3 more years. If it's not going to the right direction, maybe I will join you and say, okay, well, this is nothing. We are not going to use it anymore. But I think for now, I'm still maybe naive, but optimistic that at least as civil society, if we push very hard on it, that maybe we can push it into the right direction. On the missed points, I think it is true. I think that's why I think we have to be part of this degrowth movement, because it is indeed the reason is to avoid crisis or more crisis, because we will have crisis anyhow, as you said. I mean, environmental crisis, financial crisis, if you don't do anything. So that's why we need a planned degrowth scenario, so that we not go into a crisis and that at the end the rich people will get out of it and the poor people will suffer the most. So that's why we need a degrowth scenario, so that everybody is indeed still on the page of the well-being. And then I think it is often years ago when I was already talking about degrowth, they always called me that I was idealistic. And I say, well, I think that I'm not idealistic. I think that I'm the realist here, and that you, the ones that still believe in GDP growth, thinking that we will have 5 planets so you can build your economic growth model on, I think you are idealistic, not me. Thank you.
Patrick?
Okay, I'll try to choose from the different ones, but first on the question of the order of your, I think it was Leeds University, my personal view is you'd start, and I changed the order, by the way, several times, but ecological sustainability first, because I think that is a fundamental. We live on the planet, it's got to work, and I think as one of our earlier commentators said that, we've got no choice, we need to make the planet work. So I think that has to be the basis. So then afterwards, let's say, meeting the human needs, because the social angle is important, and then justice, because that's a sort of a social construct on top of basic needs, and finally financing, because it's a means. So that would be the way I'd order them. But I could see other ways of packaging. On financing the transition question, I'd say, let's focus a lot on fiscal reform, first of all. There's a lot of subsidies that can be reformed and refocused. There's taxation on fuels and other issues to change the whole thing. There's the fair taxation issue. There's the ethical criteria, which are linking to pension funds and investment, which are making a big change. And I was a plane back from the chemicals agency in Helsinki the other day and met someone from the Nordic Investment Bank who showed me a graph showing that the actual ethical investments were far, far, far outperforming the others. So I think there is a case of encouraging that motor. And then, of course, fair price efficiency. On the issue of principles and pragmatism, it was almost accused that pragmatism is a dirty word. I'd say it's really important to have a principled vision of the way forward, That's absolutely fine, whether it's about sufficiency and no longer believing in growth, so décroire dans la croissance. That's true. But I still think we should defend the pragmatic way forward, because one thing is having a vision, the other is actually doing something constructive about it. So I think I'd like to defend the idea of also looking at where we should do more and where we should do less in the practical steps. And that in partly echoes then as well what Leida said about the SDGs. They're not perfect, but they're a lot better than what we have now. So let's focus on that. And then finally, how to get debate. Well, I go back to the petition. I think the 238 journalists have, 238 academics have created quite a lot of groundswell. And if you look at the press yesterday, there was a huge interest. So it's by doing these things to get a public debate. And when the public debate moves forward, you can get political debate. And to tell you one more practical thing is if you look at how much public debate there's been had on plastic in the oceans, that's actually led to there being a political commitment to actually address them. So we've had pragmatism allowing progress. And I think that's quite important.
Thank you. Minister?
Yeah, I agree with Patrick. I wanted to add something that maybe it's not so enjoying to hear. I think that whatever we do, we have to engage the major institutions of the European Union in the discussion. So for me, the presence of the Commissioner here, the representative of the Commission here, was quite important today, even though we had our major disagreements. It is very important that the institutions of the European Union, and especially the Commission, is engaged in this discussion. Otherwise, we could again do a number of discussions and agree among each other, and then in the end have no results. So it is because I saw that there are some questions there. What would you in your country as a minister follow what Christian has described in the beginning of his presentation? It is not nowadays. It is not a decision of a government alone. It is a decision that has to be taken at the European Union level. Otherwise, it will not have any practical effects at all. And it is important as well that we do engage in all this discussion, the Eurogroup as well. I've so many experiences of discussions taking place at the different fora, at European level, at national level, but in the end, the policies that are implemented in the countries right now, and the member states right now, are driven by the decisions of the Eurogroup. That is, the decisions of the ministers of finance of the European Union. So I do agree that a public debate will turn things into a political debate, and this will produce results, but we have to make sure that in this discussion we engage the Commission and the Eurogroup at any level. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian.
Yeah, I also agree with the hierarchy. I already said that I'm sure if the SDG were composed by the citizens, by the people in any part of the world, in no part of the world, GDP growth would be an element included. I'm absolutely sure. And there is scientific evidence that money doesn't matter for the people if they really focus on what really matters for life. It's not money, it's not GDP. So more democracy would be that answer. And you said that there are plenty of goals. And how is the hierarchy, how is the priority between the goals? There is a clear answer. What is suable is the highest goal. And this is the distinction between rhetoric and power. What is powerful are these laws that you can sue. I come back to the example of Greece. Inclusion is the goal. No? Social convergence is the goal. So who can be sued if the minimum wage in Greece is reduced by 22%? Actually, the Greek government would have to be sued by the European Court of Justice, or actually by the European Commission, who guards the treaties, because it reduces the minimum wages, but it reduced the minimum wages on the recommendation of the European Commission. So actually the European Commission has to be sued by the European Court of Justice because the European Commission does not fulfill with the goal of inclusion and social cohesion. But the treaties don't work like that. So actually the core failure is in the treaty. And the second example, CETA promises to lower resource consumption. We very certainly it will not. It will raise resource consumption, and then who is to be sued? Nobody will be able to sue anybody because it's not in the treaty, neither of CETA nor in the European treaties. If the European treaties were serious, they would say CETA automatically is cancelled after 2 years if it does not provingly contribute to the absolute reduction of environmental consumption. That would be a coherent logic. If we look at the European treaties, they actually have goals that are primary goals. The first one is give priority of multilateral trade agreements to non-multilateral trade agreements. So already with the first criteria, CETA is against the treaty. But then nobody can sue those who agree on CETA because the treaties are flawed. And so my final message on the privatization of goals is that the European treaties are flawed. And my pessimist message is, as long as the European treaties are made by our governments and parliaments, I'm afraid we will not resolve these social and ecological and democratic problems. So my final analysis is that the citizens of Europe would have to change or write themselves the European treaties, and only then the right things can be sued. Ecological sustainability can be sued, social inclusion and cohesion can be sued. Only then.
So before I have the chance as moderator also to give a short comment, which is not foreseen in such a panel debate, I would ask Nick to give us an overview about the opinion polls through our Slido we had made.
Thank you, Helmut. So we had 3 polls running throughout the session. One was in a post-growth society, sectors like fossil fuels need a planned phase out, while sectors like renewable energies and the social economy need planned growth. And out of 22 respondents, it seems 86% agreed with that and 14% disagreed. So that's a strong call for a planned degrowth and a planned growth of what we need, it seems. The second question was, what should candidate MEPs stand for in the European elections? And there we have 0% growth of GDP in Europe. We have 60% joint EU-wide economic, social and ecological policies and progress, 40% tackle climate change before economic development, and 10% other. Final poll was what should take overarching policy primacy, standing above all other goals. Again, the EU's combined GDP needs to increase every year, 0%. The EU needs to be on track to meet all 17 SDGs, 81% and other 19%. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Nick. I think the picture is clear. I would add for the panel I have experienced and the very interesting discussion we started, that probably also the question of growth, degrowth, SDGs, challenges to the politicians, to us as citizens, and to all those who are trying to include themselves into the decision-making process and having access to the decision-making. It's a question about democracy. If we don't have the interference by scientists, by academicians, by artists, by employed and unemployed people, by trade unions, by NGOs and different views, we will not create a society which is departing from the growth understanding, in my understanding. But to give also a short, precise answer to you concerning the policy making, the Troika was a construction which has been established by purpose to impose the adjustment programs on Greece. And that is not the Commission alone. The question was an intergovernmental construction in the name of the European Union, however we explain it, where even the ECB was taken on board, where the Parliament has nothing to say on, because there was also the question, and the IMF, so an institution outside of the European Union structures. So the influence, how to deal with the challenges ahead of the realization of the Troika programs and the adjustment programs was in the interest, and here I very much agree with Christian, the capital interest. So the capitalism was the structure who imposed the way how to deal with the interest of banks, etc. So I mean, not only to be correct, so that we have in the further dealing with the economic questions we are discussing, how we are enlarging the democratic abilities of our societies to influence. And of course we have to change the treaties. The question is how we are changing the treaties, who is changing the treaties, in which direction we are changing the treaties, because I fear in the current debate in our societies, a lot of citizens would even say, no European treaties, because we want to live on our issue and putting our interest in the forefront. And I don't know exactly if this interest, looking into the own perspective alone, would solve the problem we have discussed, or we started to discuss today, when we are speaking about development in coincidence with nature, with the employment issues. And here I think we have to see how we can also, in continuing the exchange of views and the concrete and precise arrangements we find between the NGOs, between the parliamentary structures at member state as well as European Union level, and of course with third countries, the inter-exchange on the issues. And therefore I would personally say there should not be a prioritization of the SDGs. Because if there is one aim to overcome the poverty, and we have 12 years left to reach this aim, that means we have to depart from this economic growth fetishism. And if we are taking the aim of water for everybody and clean water, that means we have to rethink the whole question how we are using water resources, we are polluting water resources, etc. So I mean, we can't compare this is more important and that is more important. I think we have to find a way to include a lot of people. And yesterday I found an article from the United Nations NGO structure around the globe, where they are proposing to change the system of the United Nations to depart from the only concentration of a representationship of the states through the presidents and the ministers who are coming there and discussing, etc., and to link the United Nations understanding that we are living together and we have to shape our reality together at our globe is to include people, to have a say how the United Nations system should function. And I think that has a lot to do also with the SDGs and how we are constructing our reality. And I very much agree with all what was said about the instrument. The instruments we have to use. And at the same time, we have to communicate about the instruments so that people can use the instruments and that each and every citizen in Greece and all the other 28 member states of the European Union feel encouraged to go into the politics again and not to leave it to populists or to others and say it does not matter what I do because policy is deciding as policy wants to decide. No, I think it's really important that we take also such conferences like today as a chance to interfere into the policy making and not to let the politicians alone to decide in cooperation with the interest of the enterprises in the financial, in the productive sectors, etc., in the agriculture. And here I think we have a lot to do. There are instruments like taxation we have spoken about today. We have spoken about the question how to link job creation for young people, to give them a chance to live on their own in the future in an economy of common goods maybe. And there are a lot of good experience and examples in the EU, and I hope that our discussion gives us a certain positive stimulus to continue and to interfere and to bring in as much as possible new thoughts and ideas how economy should function in a post-growth era. Okay.